Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine, Slavic and Avar warfare between the 6th and the 7th century AD. Just a little introduction to their military culture, about which I already made specifically about these peoples from the Eurasian Steppes warfare series. Really lots of, in fact, videos already. And that I will try to look at mostly in this synthesis, mostly from a panoplistic and tactical point of view, but as you know, also in a political and strategic sense. Today we actually start from the sedentaries. You realize that in this series I add essentially a sedentary people that lurks in to the steppes practically, and here naturally most of the especially of the Slavs weren't definitely living in the steppes as well. But it's such an important chapter of the Western Eurasian migration era that I think it's important to appreciate, especially in fact in the relation between nomadic peoples settling in largely sedentary spaces at this point, and therefore gradually diluting their own original customs. The other day made a video about the Great Moravia. We have seen essentially what the Avars, especially in the later phase of their Pannonian Khaganate, looked like already as a sort of symbiosis with the Slavs, right? And lots of intersection there. And again, it's such a big topic that I will try to keep it just tidy and simple for the sake of it, and then going back on it at some other point for the details. Now, in the 6th century AD, in Eastern Europe, especially in the northern Pontic steppes, but also in the Balkans and the lower Danube, all these events were essentially changing a lot of political and strategical balance. Right. First of all, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, actually, at this point especially properly not the Eastern Roman Empire, which never existed, if not as an administrative repartition, but Constantinople, let's put it in this way, as the center of this Eurasian, properly so, sedentary civilization, with a hell of military standards and still centralized system function, right, at least comparatively to other powers around, had acquired an enormous military strength, right, and was shining in comparison, in fact, with neighbors exactly for this capacity would remain very Byzantine in nature to combine, say, the Hellenic intellectual superiority with the Roman pragmatic mindset, fundamentally, and in this way, resolutely re-establishing a great part of the former frontiers of the Roman Empire, at least the Mediterranean space that was, I made really lots of videos on Justinian and Reconquest, right, so you can check that out in the Byzantine play. I think I created a playlist on its own because the Justinian era is worth being considered as such. We've seen how the calculation was fundamentally correct, right? Nobody could quite predict, and who are we just after what happened, just a major pandemic, in a way that would have curbed their expansion possibilities, right? In any case, they did, in spite of that later, and the losses that followed, that naturally were not about the pandemic, we're generally speaking about the system altogether, right? And so mostly the political and social balance of the same, which is true for other powers out there, were actually the best possible direction the empire could take, right? It was not just a viable option after, by the way, generations of maritime power built up to retake mostly these coastal areas in which antiquity had fundamentally been surviving, right? The great demographic and agricultural shrinking, right, of late antiquity that is actually happening just with the pandemic, with the plague, not really before, right? The before had been very, very gradual, right? Had actually even favored, as we've seen, Constantinople, but was naturally the easiest territory to retake, mostly because there were coastal centers that could not quite be threatened much from the hinterland as long as the Byzantines would control the seas, and nobody else in the Mediterranean fundamentally had naval forces capable of opposing the Byzantine ones. And yet another overlooked aspect, the necessity of countering not much the Arian Gothic axis, right, that basically encompassed Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, basically the entire Danubian frontier until Illyricum, until at least the boundary between the Illyricum and Mysia and other provinces, instead in the hands of the Byzantines, that had, by the way, just actually taken up something over time that had formerly belonged to the western half among all these people's movements. That received the support, by the way, also from Central Europe, from pagan Europe, right? But especially what was namely the Byzantine ally here, that is the Merovingians, right? As long as, again, these gods were acting even as a protector for all those Central European peoples were being taken over by the Franks, that were kept in the sense out of the Mediterranean. The Byzantines were safe from them. They had mostly in the Goths their major concern. The Vandals going a bit weirdly around, being Byzantine allies against the Goths because they couldn't stand the latter's guts, but ending up, for this reason, much more easily wiped out by Belisarius during the Reconquest. And in fact, this Atlantic perspective, again, the one of countering the Merovingian Franks, and hopefully maintaining at least a Mediterranean, so the area that by far the most advanced, populated, economically prosperous area, in spite of the political collapse of the West, still under the fact, again, the Goths that had been sent by Constantinople and were ruling with basically the same identical Roman establishment there, doing the same identical things as before, being a major concern, right? At least being a great chance, right, to rebalance, to reshape. It was a huge gamble, but it was largely successful as well. And again, what happened later, also with the exhaustion of the empire, substantially later, I mean, talking one century later, in the war with Persia and the rise of Islam, etc., it could not really be predicted usefully at this point. They did well to do what they did, right? You know that I'm very Latin Germanic in bias in many ways, and I don't think the Byzantine government was particularly, nice. Especially outside. I don't think within the Byzantine territories things were. I mean, it was essentially a Constantinopolitan lordship over a much larger amount of people that didn't have, again, the politically unitary means to oppose themselves or whatever. And that's why the migrations really were quite meaningful here. Those weren't even kind of better peoples, but they had, in fact, for this reason, this taste for blowing on the embers, burning under the ashes, right, and making quite of a mess in the process, right? The Constantinopolitan Empire had proven to be solid, to be able to withstand major avalanches of peoples that, as we will see also in the next chapters, they never really stopped coming, right? From a Western European perspective, it's to us, the migration era ends in the second half of the 6th century, right? And this, again, what happened mostly with the Avars, the Slavs, is already something else, right? At best, at the frontiers. For Constantinople, it never ended, right? Literally out to 1453 and beyond. Naturally, with different dynamics from the ones of the migration era, but don't think so distant so far, especially considering the sometimes even probably the manpower from which other politics could draw against to throw against the same Constantinople. So we all know that story. I will not digress here on why I use the term Byzantine instead of Roman, but I have my reasons, made plenty of videos on that as well. And yes, I like to trigger people with that, for that matter. The important is that we really understand each other, what we're talking about. In any case, again, the Reconquest. This had been a big deal. North Africa, Italy, part of the southern Iberian Peninsula. Even we don't have the explicit information. There were possibly some cities also in southern France that, in any case, would have not felt themselves ever out of the empire, because again, this late antique dimension is also very coastal. It's very maritime, right? And the Hellenic colonies of southern Gaul had always felt to belong to that broader kind of coastal Hellenic say world, rather than the continental one, whichever it was, Romans included. And the address of Constantinople by that point was really extending on such an enormously vast territory. Any other demographic or agricultural consideration left aside now, because again, it's obvious that the Byzantine presence was much more tenuous, say, in southern Spain than I don't know, in southern Italy, for example, for obvious reasons. However, again, a huge amount of resources that could even just temporarily be brought back to Constantinople, sedimented there. In fact, again, that's mostly the reason of Byzantine government bad custom, right? Considering those lands of reconquest hardly like the heart of Rome, that they still venerated rightfully, also because there was in front of the entire world, right, no other center possible for universal domination, but specifically the city of Rome herself. And yes, still at this point, I made a video exactly about this recently during the history of Rome, between the two Gothic sieges, for that matter. And the again, the surplus they could gather from these provinces would go to back to Constantinople, together with lots of treasures, riches, etc. Right? There were still very big Roman cities in the west, especially in Italy, that had to pay massive tribute in gold, in actual, large amounts of precious metal. And this tells you also in part why these regions began to bail out and called even, for example, the Longobards in. But that's another story, and I will perhaps tell it soon. I will resume some Longobard history content, hopefully. So, looking more at the habitual, let's say, geographical sector, theater of this series, depending on Constantinople, were also regions like Crimea, Abkhazia, and part of Armenia. The Byzantine army at this point was still, as the Roman army, the top qualitative one available, right? As we will see, at least now we will concentrate on the types of troops, more or less their equipment, but their training was very, very high, right? There was an increasing distinction between the military element, the civilian one. The Roman soldiers were trained at some point for decades, right, in the use of basically every kind of weapon, right, in great part to a medium average, right, of what was available as the regular type of trooper, but mostly to have them also that flexible to cope with all these new peoples that had substantially different fighting styles, and for which the empire had to be always ready to cope. Naturally, as we will see now, there were lots of those very peoples settled in the Byzantine Empire. It was surely a capacity from the side of the Roman army to copy and actually adapt, especially at this point, much of those same people's techniques, panoplies, tactics, etc. successfully. But sometimes we're talking about literally the same human beings that were literally entering the Byzantine army and fighting just that way. And this is different. Again, this had been going on ever since Rome was around. It's all the great powers, especially in terms of the auxilia, the allies, wouldn't do differently. But the fact that the center of the empire is shifted east, and that more or less that will remain the core heartland, in the following, say, collapse at some point, with the Arab conquest, etc., one half of the entire empire was lost there, but also to other peoples for that matter. The types of troops that would be fielded by Constantinople from these populations mostly were drawn from the steppes, from steppes peoples. This will go. I made a video, for example, about Cuman horsemen a bit later on, but especially in terms of lighter cavalry, these steppes peoples were all pretty much similar throughout this time. So the Byzantine army consisted, as a consequence, of the most heterogeneous contingents, especially at this point, right? There had been a phase of, as you know, of reform, of restructuration of the army, especially in Constantinian times, that was somehow orderly and, with the idea probably of a central, statal, regular, permanent army. It was massive, by the way. It needed the boosting of an enormous amount of bureaucracy also for producing, and now in a much more centralized fashion, and shifting all the armories towards the Mediterranean heartland, given the frontiers were ever less secure, all the arms and armor production, etc. During all the mess that had been going on ever since 378, say from Adrianople onwards, all the avalanches of other peoples, the Germans, the Huns, you named them, the equilibristic politics and strategy of the Byzantines that had actually very serious problems of, say, at some point diluting at least the presence in some strategic centers of, for example, there were Germanic guards in Constantinople, could have hijacked the system like it happened in the West, but it wouldn't happen. In spite of the fact that still they would do this from a Roman perspective, right? Because they were, after all, part of the Roman army and rising through the ranks from that experience. So again, bear in mind what it means for there, because today we do not have that anymore. An ecumenic empire that is recognized by anyone independently from their allegiance. This is the most beautiful thing of it. From the most far places, right, from the Scandinavian forests to the Saharan desert, you know that there is this massive, huge thing, and you know that it's God's empire, and you want to be part of it, or to challenge it, at least to prove that you can be elevated to that degree of divinity. Well, throughout all this mess, the Byzantine army of the 6th century had found itself, was reorganizing itself once again. We will talk about this, especially from the early 6th century. It was a mix of different troops, again, mostly these allies, next to, of course, the core statal army, but there was also a degree of privatization. Think about the bucellari, right? Private retinues, fundamentally levied in, let's say, by statal subcontraction of essentially de facto the owning of those lands. In the frontiers, it's also the areas that were more habituated to sea raids, things like that, from the side of the great landlords So it's a very complex melange, but all in all, it's pretty damn effective because it's very well balanced. The Byzantines maintained some older units, added others. They wouldn't like to rationalize everything altogether because it would have costed a lot, and it was, in a sense, even useless. So you find even legions names that date to the time of Caesar, right? Together with, I don't know, Hunnic troops and other stuff that had come around just organizationally and hierarchically and whatever in late antiquity. And you find there, of course, aside from this division, really what's the main difference in terms of also military effectiveness, a core of professional units, right? That are more or less permanent troops, de facto. Then conscripts, warriors recruited from the dependent population, and even tribal barbarian corps serving for money, right? Think about, I don't know, the Longobards that joined Narses during the Ostrogothic reconquest. Again, some of these relics of Huns that had been scattered after the death of Attila and his successors, a bit all around this place. Forces coming, I don't know, from the east, from the Armenian frontier, and going back and forth, right? And yet developing an esprit de corps that had to do with that aforementioned imperial superiority and right to rule, right? You can see from Belisarius' armies that Byzantine forces were not, say, they wouldn't overspend, they weren't huge. Again, demographic and agricultural resources were becoming very, very scarce, right? Even armor, I don't know, we know in Italy during the Gothic War, Belisarius' horsemen used wood as armor because they wouldn't find much else, and it was even effective by a degree. Could be, you have all these various especially steppes horsemen that, as we have seen also in the previous chapters, are people who essentially do not have any historical traceability of human mercy, that basically are able to live out there eating anything, carcasses, whatever. They just can't build their own equipment by themselves. They have an innate sense of surviving out there in the wild, like the Roman army had always counted on a bit the less civilized peasant, right? Say tough kind of, farming youth that knew at least how to erect palisades, barricades, living out there in a forest. But these guys from the steppes were really something, say, far worse, humanly speaking, but definitely also very useful and especially cheap, because they were so poor that for them just being paid what would be paid in the army, in some ways even just the loot was a luxury in some of the most advanced regions of the world. They were very effective as warriors. Again, in part they were unreliable. It depends, there were different stereotypes nationally at the time. Some of the least reliable were actually the same Germanic troops, but those were also hired in quite consistent numbers because they bit like hell, right? Which that is one of the things, right? They were not particularly sophisticated, but they, in tactics or whatever, but they would be the best ones to launch, I don't know, an infantry charge or something. In the Byzantines, interestingly enough, and as we've seen from the Pseudo-Maurice Strategicon, had essentially certain standard tactical models to cope with each of these people as Byzantines, right? And but integrating these peoples too in their own army, so they really had lots of options, like the versatility that aforementioned mix between Greek and Roman mentality there that would top the perfect balance in Byzantine warfare is exactly at this point, like the 6th century, the early 7th, right? And for this reason, the Byzantine army was really the one that to deserve the fame for which it passed down to history, at least for those who know it. Now, the aforementioned tribal corps had their own weapons, right? But other units were, as a rule, equipped by state armories that, again, didn't have like properly a great amount of surplus, but had a very high degree of technical capacity that exactly at this point actually increased, even technologically wise, right? Actually, between in the 6th century, there was a technological advancement because resources were less, and so the advancement came even increased from previous times. Never make the silly mistake of thinking that the largest and most powerful armies are the most technological, because for obvious reasons they cannot, right? And technology also without doctrine is nothing, so it doesn't really count. So the Byzantines actually were not like what the Romans overall, even extensionally, had been. So they, in part, especially controlling what had been some of the greatest Hellenistic capitals, and with this bit of Greek technologistic bias, had been investing a bit on that as well, which also excited a bit the barbarians, because, as you know, later on, the so-called liquid fire was a thing that actually existed since ever, right? It was not even a secret or just a Byzantine thing, but at least the Byzantines were probably the ones that like to inflate these rumors, because they cared about their technological superiorities for that reason. At some point, most of the way to make the naphtha essentially was in the Caliphate, but that's still the moment in which the Byzantines imported it from there. But they said, "Oh my God, it's just a secret." The actual combination, the actual formula is all our own thing, because we only got it as Romans, etc. So when you look at the barbarian mercenaries and the neighbors of the empire, you realize that they did themselves do their best to acquire a variety of high quality Byzantine weapons, because they were really the best, right? Every people, again, had their own topping way of things. The steppe peoples had the best bows. The Germans had at least comparable metallurgical capacity, but the Byzantine army was the only one who was civilizationally superior to make a perfect synthesis of that, right? That would be quite felt on the field, right? Now, offensive weapons varied according to the branch of the army. Let's put it very simplistically this way. So the light infantry was equipped with javelins, slings, and daggers. Composite bows, powerful and resilient, were used both by foot soldiers and cavalrymen. This is a very important characteristic of the time, because of the increased importance of steppes warfare. Right, the Romans had already been using composite bows and since Parthian times, right? And they had been updating their own weapons together also with, as we've seen, this wave of Turks that essentially increased the size of these bows. Were literal longbows at that point, as we've seen. By this point, the Huns were the ones provided with the best ones. And the idea of being able to switch in every situation from, say, shock troops to missile ones, which naturally requires a very high degree of training, was crucial, right? The Byzantines cared about resources a lot, the combination of them. They were pressured, like any other people at that point. So they're even more admirable for having been able to maintain this upper hand, right? Also in that mix, and knowing how to mix these traditions from different peoples that were also struggling. We're actually struggling more than the Byzantines, right? They were at the end of the day just a sedentary culture, while the others were just running for their lives, as nomads, quite literally. So lots of hit and run tactics again, and a capacity to shelter, especially the core of the army, from being worn out. Again, fielding troops that were able to do the same thing with the enemy. The bows were worn about the neck, while arrows were kept in a cylindrical quiver on the back, slung, with a belt or something, or lots of. We see it. I mean, even if you look from the 3rd century AD, the Dura-Europos frescoes, the cases of the Lanciari, right, are that kind of thing, and it tells you also that the missile fire has really literally increased because they're massive cylindrical quivers by a degree, and you understand they needed to, they were needed for sustaining a consistent volume of fire over a considerable amount of time. Right. Heavily armored warriors, either mounted or unmounted, were equipped with long spears and swords. Scabbards usually slung from a shoulder belt. Byzantine armor, as we'll see now, was getting ever more kind of Eastern, that is, steppes-like in outlook. Right. The defensive gear comprised a large round or oval shield, which also had to do with, again, the increased need of, pairing yourself with all of these arrow hails that would rain on you. This is typical, as we will see, also of the Slavs that had to cope with the same steppes people elsewhere, and there are certain specific Slavic shield designs that would remain until the end of the Middle Ages, when, anyhow, pike and shot kicked in, and the nomadic peoples were basically without a chance. That suggests this kind of constant necessity, with having very poor armor in those places, especially during the early Middle Ages. Very rare for the average trooper, right? Needing a lot of shelter under those damn arrow fire, damn arrow fire. This shield was made of wood covered, at least in the Byzantine world, with richly decorated leather. Right, the complexity of the army and still the prevalence of the. So at this point, there is an increase in importance in cavalry that is more distinguished, but still, Byzantine infantry is pretty strong, and it does also boast itself like in a bit so in that sense of freeman idea. So where it's one of those cases in which the infantry troops could even just boast more than others on their belts and their equipment, their shields, in fact, etc. The Byzantine mentality at this point was basically not different from the one of the Iliad, right? These were Christians fighting under the cross, whatever, but the sense of glory, of heroism, of championship was there since the Bronze Age in a semi-identical way. This also for those who say that Christianity allegedly makes you less warlike and this other BS, but of course it was, especially at this point, fully adapted and to the European warlikeness. The shields also had a high iron umbo, and the helmets consisted of several riveted pieces with cheek pieces and a crest. Arguably, there was also in the Byzantine world the erosion a bit of that kind of average trooper, right? You see the Berkasovo helmets, for example, that are becoming really something, in as much as there is some guys that look ever more as knights fundamentally, but the humble trooper still has kind of skull caps of some sort, and cheaply manufactured and so on. And yes, there is that tendency a bit to feudalization even in the Byzantine Empire. The warriors, at least the best equipped ones, wore either a mail hauberk, sometimes with a hood, or a lamellar or scaled armor, respectively made of plates attached to each other or sewn to a soft base. Then there could be also a long, high-necked shirt. Here, the necessity to cover somebody's throat from arrow fire was increasing. Right, there were, as we've seen even Gothic armor were entire hoods covering the head. This kind of armor had already been around in the Roman army, again mentioning the Dura Europus frescoes again. We have hose, shoes, cloak with a hood, also as other, normal clothing. There is padded armor around, even though we don't have, unfortunately, from an archaeological point of view, as you know, much of an evidence of organic material, but it was around here. And there were very original solutions sometimes, exactly because, again, production was standardized mostly just for the for some given pieces, for like mostly for the professional corps of the army, but everything could come useful from other people's tributaries, loot and so on. And this army was essentially the one that all the enormous amount of neighbors that the Byzantine Empire even had just at this given point in time. I made a playlist called exactly Enemies of Byzantium for say highlighting the amount of peoples and countries that really fought against this army, as much as for the Roman one in general historically. Were in part adapting to this, where there was an osmotic process, right? Over time, naturally, things would change, would evolve towards different directions, etc. But as we've seen in videos like, for example, early Slavic warfare, commenting on Pseudo-Maurice Strategicon and Leo the Wise's Tactica, much of the ingenuity of these peoples, military-wise, derived from the fact they had a very poor material gear, right? They were very morally loaded, exactly for this reason. Either they broke through or go under, right? In many ways, and their fate could be really different. So we talked today about the Slavs and the Avars, right? Because their interaction is also something I will have to clarify in other videos better, because we never really discussed it. I also want to make something on the Avars alone. You know that the latter were called shepherds of peoples, right? So the idea that the Slavs had been just expanding, right, from the end of essentially the migration era, exactly being the last wave, the one that followed the trail, say the areas that had been left empty by their own neighbors, right? Mostly starting to move from north of the Carpathians and gradually settling in other areas and merging with the local population. It was a hugely spread phenomenon, geographically speaking, right? So today we will look at it only as far as basically the Byzantine territory is concerned, but as you know, it started pushing very, very far, right? In Eastern Europe, the borders with the steppes, in towards the west, in Germany, in the Alps, so actually overrunning certain areas that had been Gothic or Celtic or whatever in the past, and also it's important to stress merging that, right? Every time I make video with the local populations, every time I make videos about the Slavs, there is always the branch that says, no, here nobody moved. We were always the same people from the Neolithic. Well, of course, if we speak of kind of genetic continuity of the populations, etc., of course, that there is more continuity than discontinuity, but it doesn't matter in as much as the cultural hegemony shows that the change that was triggered throughout basically the migration era was highly meaningful from a political and identitary way, right? It's a bit like, the Italians that start calling themselves Germanic because they hate Byzantine gods and they legitimately just see them as Greek invaders, and they keep speaking Latin and writing in Latin and whatever. and of course being a Romance people, right? So here it's a bit the same thing. Arguably, some people's displacements had been greater, right? Surely the migration era was much more impacting in Central and Eastern Europe than in, say, Southern or Western Europe, because simply those areas were historically the most populated, also the richest. You couldn't quite dislodge people simply settling in their stead, right? Instead, there were substantial amounts of Central, Eastern Europe, also the Balkans, the Danubian frontier had gone depopulated, but substantially so, because already in late Roman times they weren't particularly populated. There were war zones, and generally speaking, people had gone away or died or whatever, which was amplified, by the way, with the Justinian plague that really wiped out a considerable amount of the population, right? Which meant that if you were, again, a Slav moving from north of the Carpathians somewhere, when others had left, you would have the chance, just by demographic ratio, to alter more the area than, say, migrating in Gaul or in Spain, right, where things were very different. This is really important to understand, because it seems to me that in this world we are, say, where people are resuming kind of strangely racistic divisions. We are, there is an overly stressed difference between the North, like this, the archetypical North, whatever it means, and the South, right? Especially in Europe, as if that was the biggest divide. The much bigger divide in Europe is notoriously still from those times, and even before that, between West and East, right? That's the radical difference that still affects things in a way that both the right and the left do not want to admit, because it all essentially hits the wrong button for them. But especially, we're talking about times like the 6th, the 7th century. These were probably the moment of greatest contraction, right? When you look at the Slavically occupied or just settled areas, they are, and they're going to remain, by far, by an important degree of scale, the least inhabited, productive, connected areas of Europe, right? Just maybe the very north of Europe, like places like Scandinavia or the Celtic Fringe, can't compare. There are also areas that, in this sense, would remain more isolated, right? The more north and east you move, and the least you know or have, right? So it's not a matter of, at least the documentation goes in parallel with those other factors, right? And cannot be, say, debated, historically speaking. This is the landscape. Because again, especially if you go check, if you're interested especially in early Slavic warfare, the Strategicon's description of Slavic strategy and tactics is traumatically eloquent about what these people went through and how they were surviving and what they were able to do. In that case, they were smart, right? That's the thing that fascinates you dramatically. That, of course, the Byzantines would never be historically able to really reassert a direct control, especially north of the Balkan Mountains, right? The Danubian area would always be contended with other peoples, even though they had garrisons in the most urbanized places like Mysia, roughly today's northern Serbia, etc. You would never quite control the hinterland, right? The Slavs, this is again even more the case. While in Western Europe, again, there was a much greater population density, but probably the Latins and the Germans began to live in the same places and became the same people. The Byzantine world, what had been the Eastern House, at least probably the Greek-dominated part of the empire, remained a bit like just in classical times. The Greeks were fundamentally a urban coastal civilization, right? Whatever was in the hinterland, they didn't give a damn about, because those were barbarians, right? The Latins had a completely different mentality, and so what you look at in the form of the Byzantine world is it's just basically this very powerful coastal urbanized reality that controls a base hinterland that is just obliged to depend on the cities because they're the places where the only port with the at the end of the valleys where all the markets were, where the exports came from, and that's what essentially the Byzantine world really was. The hinterland was often heavily molded. And the Slavic invasions / migrations are basically the best example of that, because the Slavs emerged, even though the Stalinist propaganda made a bit too much of a meme out of this. A massive kind of mostly a popular force, right? Demographic peasantry force. Some of these Slavs were not even, they were just settling in some places. They weren't particularly cohesive from a political point of view, because the places where they came from were without surplus, right? And during the migration era, it was mostly the nomadic peoples coming from the east and crossing their lands that would shepherd them into these other places. This had been already going on even before the Turks. This had been going on under the Iranians. We have made a video about the ethnic origins of the Serbs. We think that many of these peoples, what we actually call, that are actually Slavic, at least culturally, identically, ethnically, were actually created by a pocket of steppes knights that lorded over a certain place, that installed themselves during migration, even just as scattered peoples, broken peoples, like the Alani or other Sarmatians. And eventually it hegemonized this area. They surely merged with the rest of the population, but also kept moving over time, even well through in the High Middle Ages. And so the ethnogenesis of this area, that is also, again, gravely underdocumented compared to anything there is in Western Europe. And this is partly valid actually for the Byzantine world too, because they had a much more sclerotic, elitistic society that didn't really write from a kind of middle class standpoint, like in the allegedly more backwards Latin Germanic West, right? The thing would have been like, prevents us from knowing most of the things were actually happening there. So literally the Strategicon and the Tactica are the only sources, aside from archaeology, that tells us also pretty standard things, right, about Slavic warfare and armament, etc. That we rely on in order to describe this. Now let's give a look to it a bit more in depth. Right, so in the 6th century, the Slavonic tribes that had reached the lower Danube became the main threat to the empire, in a sense, right? Not much because they were particularly aggressive, per se, right? But not much because they were politically cohesive. In fact, they actually weren't. The problem was exactly this. They were all fragmented, many. They would just push through the essentially an open frontier, right? It wasn't really like a wall or even if there had been, right? The problem of manning that's why also the Chinese wall didn't work on the long run. Is that, again, you must these things work just as a point d'appui for an army, right? And the Balkan hinterland was becoming, especially because of all these raids, as we will see now, there was pretty nasty mix of steppes, warriors, and Slavs, right? Combining their intrusions as a massively deep frontier that, in fact, would remain gravely, disturbed over time. So some of those areas were even advanced for, say, ancient standards, but with the migration era, the few ones actually was, I'm talking about Moesia, right? That was the only fertile area along the Danube, along the entire Danubian frontier. But that would, on the long run, be worn out by this continuous political military pressure, instability, and so on in the area, right? So the Slavs would just pour everywhere, right? In pockets, in war bands, in also larger groups. There were some, chiefdoms, some tribes, and even confederacies. But let's say they were limited in capacity, mostly settled somewhere. They could have a provincial range, but as we've seen in the video about the Great Moravia the other day, that's the only first Slavic state that appears fundamentally in the 9th century. Right? Let's leave aside the Bulgarians that were, in fact, we call them Bulgarians and not Bulgars because they're Slav, but at least their original state was founded by the Bulgars, so we will see hopefully in the next episode, right? So they had been structuring their power in a different way. They were also kind of part of the Byzantine Empire in a way, and this is the point, that as insidious as the system is, because sometimes you don't know what happens again in the interland, you don't have enough forces to really control all these movements. The Slavic migration gave further manpower and workforce to the empire in many areas, right? In fact, the Slavs already from the 5th century have been spreading in all directions from their homeland, as we've seen, situated north of the Carpathians in the so-called Pripyat marshes, even though they're not really marshes but forests, where they had basically been sheltering themselves during this massive waves of, again, Huns, other people, and just finally coming out when things were a bit colder, right, and safer, apparently. So, and still meeting, as we've seen, those steps guys out immediately out of that, saying, where do you think are you going? Come with me, and similar things. And I'm actually making a meme out of that. There was a substantial degree of Slavic autonomy in these movements as well. But the bigger powers, especially the Avars, we will see now, had really a huge influence on Slavic migrations, if not properly a control on a substantial part of them. The Slavs had surely also come out in war bands, and they had been roaming around. We can't quite track these peoples ethnically so easily, right, in the migration era mess, right? The other day I spent a considerable amount of time trying to explain how mixed and messed up the entire Hunnic, Gothic, Iranian thing really is. In any case, they mostly, given their location in the Barbaricum, served the Huns, right? They began to expand also in pushing against the Germanic boundaries, right? At some point against the Goths, some point simply even there, just infiltrating, right? Where the Longobards were migrating into Italy, their northern Moravian frontier was already being settled by, in fact, Slavs. So again, it was impossible to control, even with the much less effectively coercive means of the time. Such number of people in such vast amount of places was really impossible, practically, even to establish any kind of permanent, stable local power capable of even having which reach territorially to do what? Create a huge barricade with which resources, right? It was just impossible, and really nobody had been wanting to live there, because again, the Germans had all left, or at least a substantial amount of them, and the Slavs had been replacing them when these had been moving mostly to the Mediterranean. So where the better land really was. So at this point, it's undeniable that the Slavic elites had already been developing a substantial amount of aggressiveness and political strategic vision, right? They had been co-opted by these conquerors. They had their own elites, their own cavalry. Just they wouldn't particularly stand out for particular tactical development. They had everything the others had except less, right? In less proportion. In fact, most of their forces consisted in infantry, right, and practically an armored one, right, or at least, literally just a spear, shield, right, a helmet if they were lucky. So the Slavic warrior bands raided the Byzantine territory, not just settled there, right? They drove away cattle, they plundered, they killed, carried away people, and it was very difficult again to control them. In more than one place, the frontier of the empire was thus broken, right? Through and while clans and tribes of Slavs began to settle in Thrace, so next door to Constantinople, what is now Bulgaria. And the larger part of the Balkans, really, even some areas of Greece, right? The Peloponnesian hinterland was Slavicized. We think that Slavs actually took the sea. They crossed into North Africa in various bands, right? It's actually witnessed, and there's really nothing strange about the entire concept. Naturally, other Slavs had been departing to other directions, right? The Vandals seems to have included a substantial amount of Slavs, Proto-Slavs, and at best the Byzantines would have found them in Africa by that point, where they mostly remained settled. Like the surviving Goths were, in Italy, for example, if they weren't deported or enlisted forcibly to be sent somewhere else in the front, locally as military colonists. In that case, against the Berbers, right, of the hinterland. So, what could the empire really do? Well, it could retaliate with punitive expeditions. At the same time, they could exercise some authority on these Slavs, because at the end of the day, sending a field army in the Balkan hinterland would tame at least the most stabilized and thus also the most important and richer Slavic communities. They were small fish, especially as we will see now, the Avars settled in the Hungarian plain. But there was still, of course, a substantial amount of Byzantine Slavic troops as well, and some would simply say, "Well, what do you do?" I don't know. I settle in a place like Macedonia. Let's assume, I have nothing to lose. I will enlist in the Byzantine army, or at least I will, because it's unrealistic to think they were just doing it independently. At least my clan leader, the local landlord, will take me under his protection and will serve him abroad, things like that, right? So the empire relied, generally speaking, on the same Slavic communities that eventually settled within their own territory. Because again, they just wanted better land, so they didn't even care about being under the empire. Again, it was normal to think that there was an empire out there, right? No Slavic power at that point was really capable of overthrowing the empire. At best, they could try to do that under the Avars that had a hell of an advanced military. They were considered essentially the most advanced of the barbarians, militarily wise, in the Strategicon, right? But they were just under somebody else largely, and they again, there was the empire. The empire was not a border. The empire was literally a metaphysical entity that was there, that you had to relate yourself existentially in a way or another. Interestingly enough, as we can learn again from the Byzantine treaties, these Slavic troops were considered powerful, adroit, sturdy, and courageous. Right, the Slavs mostly were fanatic defenders. The main problem is that you could even launch a raid against them, but they would lead in such a way that had literally settled themselves in the way to functionalize the retreat in the forests, in the mountains, carrying out amphibious operations, being very quick to move across the Balkan hinterland, which is frankly a nightmarish place, not less than, say, the Italian Apennine or the Iberian Peninsula. And the Slavic troops were thus, as we've seen, part of the cheap ones you could simply recruit in large numbers. You would mostly, however, rely on to, at that point, act as the local colonists, local farmers. I mean, they had gotten their land finally. They would also defend it from invaders at that point. They could also switch and join the raid, right? Hopefully to get something else, but stability would prevail over time. Now, the average Slavic weapons were javelins, spears, battle axes, small simple bows, right, of the European type. Again, they did surely have in part some composite, but they mostly stuck to the European sedentary tradition, in which the bow is one and only since prehistory, and there's never a single change in the entire history of it. The poison arrows too were a thing too that really shows how far they would go just to hope to take out that enemy, because they were constantly fearing to be wiped out. They wanted to really cause as much damage as a deterrent, to be left alone, right? And they had, as we were saying before, this enormous wooden oval shields, or sometimes also naturally smaller ones, but mostly the former type being developed, and surely also way before the migration era in the Proto-Slavic world, to cope against the steppes horsemen, right? And this is something that goes on forever in this crescent that stretches from the Balkans, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. This concave area, east of which you have steppes peoples arriving and striking and smashing like crazy, and you can easily see, even genetically, in as far as Central Europe and Eastern Europe, even more, of course, the most obvious steppes influence, even somatically, phenotypically, and so on. So that tells the history of a ferocious millenary struggle between the sedentary farmer and the nomadic herdsman. And we're speaking about levels of brutality that I cannot quite describe in a video, because otherwise they will take it down, but you can imagine what it really meant to live like that. I mean, there are some episodes that tell you even just the level of physical resistance, and again, how they were simply habituated to live, because that's it with humans, right? You do not live in a world in which you think that, I don't know, what matters is what your emotions are, right? What matters is, first of all, for you to stay alive and to sort out ways to accomplish that, hoping that you're not already dead by the time you're thinking this, wasting time to think about the unnecessary in it. And it's not just even you're going to die likely in a brutal way anyway, and especially if you are one of those warriors, this brotherhoods that were roaming around and killing each other. And mostly the Slavs, of course, fought against other Slavs. That's always the interesting thing. So their warfare was very carefully designed to be that brutally effective. You don't want to live in the early 7th century in a Serbian mountain. You just do not want that, believe me. The Slavs typically wore long, narrow trousers, leather leggings, sometimes also embroidered shirt and cloaks. And as far as their arms and armor, well, they had pretty standard kind of types, mostly, again, deriving as designed from this broader, either sedentary Byzantine Mediterranean world or the steppe one as well. They were influenced by the Germans in the West, and so their elites would be, armored with some spatai, with mail, with Spangenhelm types, and they would have a mounted elite as well, right? Except, again, all in less numbers than basically any other around, except perhaps, again, the very northern fringe of Europe, right? Admittedly, some of them were somehow wealthy and powerful. So again, I don't want to just radicalize the categorical, law that, but again, if one starts understanding the degree of material poverty that existed in Eurasia during especially the second half of the 6th and the first half of the 7th century, well, you would immediately agree it's not a stereotype. Like, you literally, there was no armor around, right? If not for the ultra elite, especially in a context like Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans, etc. In any case, that's not really even important when you realize that everybody around is pretty much the same, right? The Byzantines actually are some of the ones that have the largest amount of surplus, so they, as we've seen, they care about having few but good troops, so it would be difficult to cope with them in open field. But again, enter a forest, enter a swamp, enter what mostly, in fact, those armies didn't go in the first place because they knew what would happen and wouldn't make much sense, but because those are marginal areas. So again, these peoples mostly contented themselves of the forested hills, of some places that could really entrench themselves even into swamps. We know that, right? And they weren't just hiding from the Byzantines, or again aggressing them, carrying out guerrilla warfare, any kind of attrition possible. Definitely, there were also these other pretty scary motherfuckers from the steppes that were arriving, really, and the Avars were something, right? They weren't really barbarians, right? The Huns are overrated, considering at least what we made of them in, say, in literature. In a way, the Avars were really advanced for steppe standards. Now, get me wrong, the cocktail is basically the same, right? They do not essentially differ much from Central Asian warfare as we have described here. However, they're also interestingly influenced by a higher degree of siege warfare. For example, the Chinese Avar trebuchet, for example, appears in Europe around this time to develop into most of the trebuchet forms we've seen. It's not just merely this kind of Eastern influence, but it's also, of course, adapting to the kind of strategy by a degree. So the Avars are extremely insidious. When they arrive in the what would be the Hungarian plain, they were somehow all scattered. They weren't so strong, right? The strength of these peoples stands, and of any people in any time of history, always, and it's by far the single most important thing, from political cohesion, where you can have the single most advanced, technologically advanced thing, whatever. If you're not politically cohesive, also if you're not morally loaded in that sense, right? If you do not know what a civilization is, how a state works, for real, not just, strange, in fact, absolutistic BS, right? Those is, in fact, from the peoples in the world that still today are subjects and slaves, but actual civilization, right? The rest doesn't count. If you are politically compact, you win, right? And the Avars compacted dramatically in the Hungarian steppes. They did have, again, this doesn't cancel, how many other politically compact peoples you have around you. So that's another thing. For the series on a bigger scale, the experience of the humble Slav, on a larger scale, you may be wiped out at the end of the day. And usually steppes peoples, as we've seen, are not really more advanced than the sedentary ones. The Avars are a pain in the behind for the Byzantines, for the Merovingians. They launch raids everywhere in the Balkans, in Germany. They harass the Longbirds, the Slavs especially. So nobody really likes them. But they like themselves enough to establish this khaganate, which for a couple of centuries will spread terror around and reach some of the highest military qualities of the time. So the Avars were essentially Turkic-speaking nomads. There were Indo-Europeans, there were other groups, there were even Mongol elements, surely. We see very Far East Asian genetics from the elite toms, right? So they were really, again, very exotic, let's put it in this way. They came straight from Central Asia, fundamentally, we'll have to make a video on them to be more. Now I'm skipping the thing brutally, but to make the long story short, they had basically entered Europe. They had routed and overwhelmed and dominated mostly the southern Slavonic tribes, because at this point even the concept of a southern Slav or a West did not exist, right? It's the fact that there is this Hungarian plain that is the westernmost steppe area that's severed in two the Slavs. Again, I keep repeating the video about Great Moravia, just because I made it recently. But again, that was the moment in between during the 9th century where the Avars would be knocked out by the Carolingians, and the Magyars had yet to arrive at the end of the century, where there was legitimately nobody in between. So the Western and Southern Slavs began to bridge the gap, and establishing something in between, which is quite interesting. But up to that point, they had been entrenching themselves ever more in the surroundings, the Sudeten, the Carpathians, the Dinaric Alps, etc., because the Turkic nomads from Central Asia controlled the plains, right, and would be able to summon these Slavonic tribes that were around them as subjects and to throw them at the Byzantines, and especially to float essentially on a sea of these peoples that were needed, by the way, on to just for the most, especially for siege warfare, right, as sappers, as brutally exploitable manpower and working force, right, while the ferocious and bulky and both physically and panoplistically speaking, our elite would simply stay there waiting for those Byzantines to pay tribute, things like that. Again, as I was saying before, it's a bit difficult to explain the complete lack of any form of human mercy that would reign in a culture like the Avar one. So also these peoples did pretty interesting things that probably shocked the highest peaks of barbarism existing in Europe at the time. But this brutality had been functional to establish their own supremacy in the area and just their survival, to come out of the steppes alive, which is already a big deal, really. So how were the Avars equipped when they were attacking Constantinople together, with their cavalry and together with the Slavic infantry? Well, first of all, the Avars brought to Europe an important series of innovations, as we were saying before. I also made a video about the Byzantine military tent, which seemingly was copied from this time onwards from the Avar ones. They were hyper-functional, because they were perfect just to be mounted everywhere, in terrible weather, being hyper-protective for the troops and so on, because again, what happens in the steppes unfortunately doesn't remain in the steppes, such as this avalanches of peoples constantly terrorizing half of Europe, but let's say at least is designed in a way that has to cope with, brutal thermic excursions and just being able to move constantly again. So this functionality was very appreciated, and the Avars, as we've seen, were very advanced in many ways. They brought to Europe, for example, a saddle with high pommels that was functional to sustain this massively armored knights, right? So much so that the Avars are the guys who bring in syrups to Europe. All right, it wasn't much of an Eastern, say, Persian thing. So they came through the Avars, right? And most actually of the sense of even the Byzantines were influenced mostly by the Persians, military speaking. Actually, throughout most of this time, the largest amount of military innovations in the West stemmed from the Avars, right? At least, again, technology is nothing, right? Contrarily to what the majority of people think, stirrups have literally nothing to do with the development of heavy cavalry. They are a consequence of it, which is a very different thing. So the reason why the Avars had this stuff is that they had, naturally as heavier knights, developed a much more shockingly impacting cavalry tactics that necessitated people fixing on, on the horse without being literally catapulted tens of meters away and breaking their backbone, as it regularly happened. Like in medieval Europe, there were, during the Reconquista, the Arabs saying there were certain Christian knights literally chained to their horses, right? Because the impacts and the forces were brutal in the first place. As I said before, cavalry charges were carried out at 45 kilometers per hour. Imagine you have to smash against a guy that arrives at the same speed as if you have to crash into a wall at 90 kilometers per hour. That mostly you will like to avoid that, but it's not really going to happen. Cavalry does charge straight into each other, right? The myth that horses avoid obstacles is bullshit, especially the steeds that were mounted by these ones that were, hyper testosterone loaded, that just smashed into everything they saw, even killing themselves, and they didn't give a fuck about that because they were trained exclusively to behave like that, right? And to be obedient immediately to anything that the knight told them to do. So, needless to say, these men were, dramatically advancing any kind of, equestrian, zootechnic capacities and so on. But this massive saddle, stirrups, were all functional to keeping the guy well on horseback during this massive impacts. This reveals also generally speaking, the wealth, and so the success and the, swaths of people that the Avars had slaughtered just to come to that point, because they had enough surplus to be able to hold on such a base. This is not much just about the, let's say, the amount of surplus per se, but how you organize society, right? So if you manage to have this hyper-powerful elite, it means that this elite is so loaded it can afford it to be itself for a long enough time over a larger amount of people. Admittedly, by the 8th century, when the Franks crushed them, they had softened up, that they had gentrified, it had settled down, so it's a very different thing. But at this point, they were the thing, right? Their swords were, as we've seen, of the Turkic straight single-edged bladed type, and later on they would evolve into sabers, right? Further, which is not really much of a positive thing. It means that knightly power, as we've seen, declined, but still, at least the elite had still this massive blades could easily chop to pieces, cut in half people, horses, anything. The heavy cavalry of the Avars wore helmets which were either riveted or made of narrow strips of iron tied together with a finial and panache. There are beautiful examples preserved even among surrounding people. So some Germanic knights were basically the copy of an Avar one. Or if you look at, I don't know, at the Longbird horsemen, the ones, especially of the first generations, you can't really distinguish and say this is a German, this is an Avar. It doesn't make any sense. Same goes for the Slavs, actually. Some of their wealthiest elites would be able, like, naturally to be, especially as they had been co-opted and wanted to imitate the ruling people that would just, or the most powerful one, right, at the outskirts of which they live, they would naturally keep themselves like this, but they had to be hyper ultra rich and maintain that wealth, which was a huge deal in such a politically unstable system. But the helmet didn't end here. It was extra protection such as earpieces, a small tippet that is camel, right? And as we've seen, it's really important here to get protected by arrow fire, because the Byzantines don't kid either, right? As we've seen, they had lots of these very peoples within their own ranks themselves, and just, when you're another knight storming a Byzantine fortress, you really want to go safe in. Well, let's put it in this way, without stressing too much other analogies. In any case, the most impressive and expansive element was the lamellar armor cuirass, right, with shoulder pieces, cuisse or brassards of iron strips. Also round wooden shields, as we've seen, similar essentially to the ones of the Göktürks back in Central Asia, were but rarely used. The concept of these shields is, again, in times of great material poverty, generally speaking, still having an extra protection, an effective one you could use in different situations. Consider these guys were, again, the stormtroopers of the situation. They would be the ones dismounting and having to climb up the enemy walls when storming a place, because they acted as men-at-arms, right? So that helped to protect themselves against this incessant hail of missiles. Considering also the Avars were able to put up again a vicious resistance, right? You don't. That's another thing you don't want to do with it. That is to say, assaulting just straight away, head down a Slavic hilltop, right? You're going to have the hell pouring down stones, javelins, poisons, arrows, spears, whatever, right? Whatever, and that's something you want to be protected from, because again, you have to go in, right? The average Avar horseman was just a humble horse archer, didn't have practically anything special compared to any other in that sense. But when you understand what the whole system is about, in terms of combined arms, when you look at the elites of these people, right, and you understand that in a society where there is such few armor around, when you have very heavy armor, massive, curved, single-edged blades, you know that these very guys are the ones who are going to not engage just against one another. Of course, these weapons were useful even to force armor by a degree and so on, but they're simply cutting to pieces an avalanche of people at a time, right? Chopping like crazy. You have all the armor necessary to get close combat, which the others are going to avoid, because they don't have much of a defense. Usually, then you find the crazy guy that just takes on you, and because he just has the upper hand mentally, right? At great risk. But it's just about getting to the crowd and starting to chop people to pieces. And these things did happen quite savagely. So again, the Avars were not exactly what you call the particularly tender-hearted people per se. Because again, if you come out of the steppes, you're not a psychologically sane person anymore. But what is sane anyway? And that's exactly how the Avars went by existing, simply that. And the Avars also brought to Europe special heads for cavalry lances that were designed to be also anti-armor to a degree. They had their own means, as we've seen, to be that. In knightly impact, again, the Alani are probably the people in Europe that revitalize also probably the knightly mystique of the Indo-European peoples, but the Avars were the ones who probably contributed the most in terms of panoply, right, in technicality, material stuff, right? And this is debatable, right? Of course, we're not so distant, right? Technological advancements were very important, but ridiculous compared to our own in merely material terms. So there was surely a combination of that, but really for example, quivers of a specific shape. Again, this mostly tells us also who's who, generally speaking, from the steppes or among the cemeteries, because they have very specific functions. So you can find, of course, as we were saying before, subjects that were pretty much Avar-looking, or semi-nomadic peoples like the Germans that up to a few centuries before had been, and still were technically, in fact, not were semi-sedentaries as they were semi-nomadic, and that for the occasion they would on the move, and in that kind of meat grinder that Barbaricum was at this point, they would equip themselves, if they could afford it, with this mostly steppes kind of arms and armor, so much that you cannot distinguish them. But this panoply was also functional to the same combat, where you see these Avars were mostly they had some infantry, not just from the Slavs or just on their own, as long as they would lose freedom being just on foot, which was disgusting in their perspective. But of course, you can have a Germanic freeman, nobleman, say, equipped with just as a complete identical copy of an Avar knight, but still fighting in an army that had practically nothing to do with that. Right, the Germanic cavalry didn't fight like the other one. They were mostly infantry, by the way. They used to dismount much more frequently. They had, generally speaking, even less, not necessarily even less armor around, which it would be interesting to compare, because, again, most of the Avars were horse archers without any armor, and speed and lightness was their advantage. But in any case, we're talking about arms and armor that can be used in different contexts, just because they, at the end of the day, they do the same thing. What's better, lamellar or it doesn't matter. This is just a demented internet subculture that has emerged together with HEMA, together with obsession for it was born essentially out of RPG games, right? For people to still think we would win with an army all equipped, like one with halberds and another one with, what the fuck questions are there? But that's mostly with the pattern through which they kind of go still, without looking at the overall picture. The Avars, I don't remember which point it was making, but basically if you look at the design of these armor, you find them until the 20th century among Siberian peoples, tribes, things like that, because the design is identical. If you pick, again, a 17th century Tibetan armor or a 6th century Alemannic one, they are in design, they're the same thing, because the steppes remained a bit asleep over time, or at least lagged behind, and still there wasn't much that could be done differently there until industrialization arrived. The other features, well, longbows kept unstrung in a stocking-shaped case. They knew how to take care of their bows, of their strings, fighting in any kind of weather. Just for those people who say the Mongols couldn't win in Europe because it rained that year. Yes, sure. So they, given that, because they had bows, and the string got humid, the elasticity of the bow got, In fact, notoriously, they didn't conquer Russia in winter, right? Nor they fought in other, tropical places or whatever. That's the kind of the interesting narratives that you hear sometimes around, right? The pure technologistic mental disorder and severe underschooling, which has been basically the standard for at least the people who went to school. There were the ones that didn't go to school at all, but at least maybe they did not have a technologistic. Maybe, I don't know. I usually don't have much experience with those. The Avar fashion was a thing. far and wide, right? In Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the same Byzantine Empire. As we've seen, military tents were adopted seemingly from the Avars. There's all these other interesting gadgets, let's put it in this way. And even the long kaftans of the Avars came into vogue in Constantinople, right? So it's a bit like the niceties of politics, right? Like today, when countries make war and there are people in different countries that for one side is for group is for one side, the other is for the other, even though they don't understand anything, but they start mimicking, and being provocative and painting their own distortion version of reality, right? But intersections are there always, so never think to be immune from that. It's actually a symptom of that kind of mental disease. In any case, I would stop it here. Again, I made, I think, different videos already that are titled something like The Avars, the Slavs and the Bulgars, or the Byzantine Frontiers, the Avars, the Arabs, and the Slavs, or things like that, right? So we will keep talking about them. Doesn't end here, definitely. So I'm open for as many Byzantine, Slavic, or Avar warfare videos as possible. And as you know, I've already done that. This is just a ridiculously short introduction to some aspects, at least, of these people's military cultures. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.